basically provide support, like letting you guys know which scholarships you should be applying to, and we also take our club members out to different events. For example, this coming October, we are taking our members to the UC Davis Pre-Health Conference, completely free of charge. We'll have a bus come to Cañada, and then we'll all head over there and network and enjoy the conference together, and I think that's a great opportunity. So if you're interested in joining, if you could raise your hand, and I'll have one of my co-club members come around and give information. Is anyone interested? Okay, thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Carol Rhodes. I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about her before she comes up here to amaze you. Professor Rhodes is locally sourced, having grown up in San Jose. She earned her bachelor's degree in biological sciences at UC Davis, woohoo, where she fell in love with genetics and plant science. For graduate school, her advisor said, "Go elsewhere." So she headed to the northern land of lakes, Minnesota. At the University of Minnesota, she studied plant physiology and plant breeding, while her research involved genetic modification of plants using biotechnology. She continued this work at Calgene, back in Davis. Is Calgene right? Awesome. And then in the Bay Area at Sandoz. Professor Rhodes has been teaching here for 12 years and continues to be amazed and impressed with Cañada students and the field of genetics. So let's give her a round of applause. Thank you.
You heard about my background, so you know that I have done research in the field of genetic modification of crops. And, yeah, I should have. Thank you, Rand.
So I've done research in that area for about 10 years or so. It was very exciting. I started right when they really had first proven that DNA could be inserted into plant cells and incorporated into the genome.
Do you have a outlook here?
Here we are a number of years later. Okay, but full disclaimer, I do not own any stock in Monsanto. I have no vested interest, financial or otherwise, in any of the genetically modified crops. Okay? But I find that there's a lot of misconceptions about GM crops, genetically modified crops, what they are, what they aren't, how they're made. Okay, a couple of years ago, it was one of the propositions on the California ballot that all GM foods need to be labeled, and it was defeated. And many people were quite disappointed. Okay. I'm not sure people knew really what they were asking for in that proposition, or what the implications would be. Okay, but at any rate, so when given the opportunity, I said, yes, I'd love to come and talk about it. So let's look at this. Okay? What are genetically modified crops? How are they made? Okay? What are the consequences of it? And I've decided I'm going to focus on just a few consequences. The first question you should be asking, though, is why is this important? Well, it's important because actually, as of now, this slide's a bit dated, but as of now, there's almost 200 million hectares a year which are used to grow GM crops worldwide in over 30 countries. So it's not just U.S. agriculture that's using them, it is worldwide. Okay? And it's a question that a lot of countries have dealt with. Some of you might say, wait a minute, there are countries in Europe there where genetically modified crops are grown, but I thought the EU didn't allow them. They don't allow them in their food supply. they do allow farmers to grow them and ship them elsewhere. And surprisingly or not, farmers have embraced them actually and have grown quite a bit of GM crops in those countries. Okay, so that's why it's important. GM crops have actually been grown for over 20 years now. But what are the impacts? So now we can look at it and say, we have a track record. It's not just speculation about potential or possibly this or maybe that. We've got 20 years of field test. And we can look at the outcomes and say, all right, what's important here? I narrowed it down to these 3 questions when trying to evaluate GM foods. Are they safe? Are they safe for the human food supply? That is certainly a question that I think comes up first for a lot of people. Okay. Secondly, how do they affect the environment? Okay. That's also one that has a lot of repercussions. Let's pay attention to that. Okay. And then thirdly, what are the economic impacts? Because I don't know of any human activity that's done in a major way unless you consider the economic impacts of it. Okay, so I'm going to briefly address these things. And I welcome questions as we go. One of the first ones might be, how are GM plants made? How is the genetic modification done? I think it's important to understand it. The best picture, the best diagram I could find happened to have labels in French, but that really doesn't matter. The diagram was good. Okay, I say GM 1.0. This is the old-fashioned way that's been done for the previous 20 years. Most of them were done like this, where you find a gene of interest, okay, you isolate the DNA for that. It could be from another plant, it could be from a microbe, it could be from any other organism. But that gene confers a trait that you want to put in the plant. Okay, so you isolate that, you integrate that into a larger piece of DNA that then you can then grow up, get a lot of. You somehow get that DNA into plant cells. This is what a lot of my work was on. Either you literally shotgun it in, okay, or you can use nature's method, agrobacterium, which naturally inserts DNA that will then be incorporated into the plant chromosome. Okay. There's other methods of using an electrical charge that moves the DNA into the cell and into the nucleus where it gets incorporated. It's actually pretty surprising how many ways there are to get DNA into a cell. Once it's in, okay, there is a random chance that it will be incorporated into a chromosome. So usually you have to grow the cells up and have some kind of a screening mechanism for how you can find those cells that have taken up the DNA. Okay, so you do that. Then you regenerate plants. Typically this involves some manipulation with environmental conditions, especially plant hormones, so that you can recover a plant from it. Then you can evaluate that plant. Hopefully it is still fertile. You get progeny, evaluate the progeny, make sure the trait is inherited, that it's stable, that it behaves the way you want to. Once you have that trait in the plant, you can cross it to any variety of that crop that you want. Okay, so that's sort of the basics of how it's done. Questions at this point? No? Okay, so then we have the 2.0 version. Okay, and that consists of a different method of getting the DNA incorporated. Okay, before you would take a plasmid with the DNA, put it in, and you really had to do a lot of screening in order to find a plant where the incorporated gene would behave the way you wanted it to, would express at the level, the right time, that would make a difference in the trait you're trying to develop. Okay? But a few years ago, Jennifer Dowden at Berkeley came up with this technology used called CRISPR with Cas9. It's just an acronym for a set of RNAs and enzymes, originally isolated from bacteria. It was an immune system response in bacteria, a way to deal with viruses. But what it allows you to do is to target a particular spot in the recipient genome. So you can figure out exactly where and in which chromosome you want to insert the gene. This would include replacing a gene. This would include eliminating a gene that's already present. Okay, so this really allows surgical precision in genetic modification in a way that was never possible before. Okay, and so it really has changed the whole ballgame when it comes to genetic modification. If you read at all about human gene therapy, everything is done using this technology. And I imagine going forward now, all plant genetic modification, any animal genetic engineering will all be done using versions of this CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Yes?
So how do you tell the set, you said it was a set of RNA and enzymes?
Yes.
How do you tell it where to go?
You design the RNA. So you can synthesize RNA in the lab. So you create a piece of RNA that is homologous to the sequence that you want to alter.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yes?
Is it 100% certain that it will target, like say if it was gene therapy and you have some kind of hereditary issue, is it 100% certain that it will target the right area and cure the problem?
The devil's in the details. The question was, is it 100% reliable? Can you be that certain that, for example, with gene therapy, that you can go in and alter specifically just that gene in just that way? Well, it turns out there are several different versions of CRISPR-Cas9. And some versions work better in plants, some versions work better in animals, and so they are continuing to refine the system that will work in humans. It's getting very close. It's not 100%, but it's better than 90%, which is why gene therapy, I think the first gene therapy was approved and done in the US within the last year. Okay. The first approved gene therapy was done. Okay. In researching this, I was amazed. There were ads that kept popping up about, do-it-yourself-at-home kits for CRISPR-Cas9. It's like, holy smokes. Yeah, it's an amazing technology. Yes?
So what is gene therapy?
Gene therapy, the whole idea there is that you can go in to a cell, and a cell that has a gene that has been mutated or is in some way defective, and it's not working the way it should, that you go in and put in the right version of it. So, I'm trying to think. Marfan syndrome. It's a particular disorder in which there is a protein, a connective tissue protein that's not made correctly, and it typically results in a defect in cardiac muscle. Okay? And again, it's the problem. This connective tissue protein is not functional. So if you could go in and add a gene for the correct version of that, and then that would be fixed in whatever cells you could deliver it to. The kicker here is if you do it at the embryo level, then it becomes genetic engineering, because progeny of that individual as it grows up, that change would be incorporated into the gametes and get passed to the next generation. If you do it with somatic tissues, with adult tissues that don't give rise to sperm or eggs, then you're just altering the gene in that individual and not in their offspring. That's gene therapy. Other questions? These are all great questions. Anything else? Yes?
And you haven't got to it yet, ma'am, but what is the biggest misconception out there about this process? You mentioned the Europeans that you export it, they don't consume it, so there must be some significant.
There is a concern about the safety of GM foods, whether or not they are safe to eat, and let me address that. I just briefly, slight divergence first. Which genes are being added to crops? These are ones that are in commercial production now. Okay, so let's look at these for a minute. Most people are familiar with the pest resistance one, commonly known as BT. It's short for the organism from which this gene was derived. And it confers a toxin, basically, that discourages the growth of caterpillars. Okay, so when they consume the plant, okay, and it's very active against corn rootworm, bollworm and cotton. I forget exactly which one attacks poplar, sorry, and another one in potato. So Monsanto owns the rights to this gene, and they have put it in a fair number of crops. Okay, so that's BT. Herbicide resistance. The most common one right now is resistance to glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup. And again, that one has been put in quite a few crops. So these two genes account for probably the vast majority of GM crops that are grown. Okay. Another one, vitamin A. So the precursor to vitamin A, actually, beta-carotene, okay, is used to produce golden rice. Here's normal rice. Here's rice that's had the gene to make this inserted in here. The gene came from carrot or daffodil, I think. They may have two versions of it. The current one may be from carrot. Originally it was from daffodil. But again, much higher levels of vitamin A, which is one of the three most common nutritional deficiencies for humans, especially those that depend upon rice for most of their calories. Virus resistance in papaya. Papaya basically would no longer be a commercial crop were it not for the virus resistance that was added, because there was a virus that was unstoppable any other way. So this basically saved an entire industry. New one coming up that was approved a couple of years ago, so I haven't yet seen it on the market, but it'll show up pretty soon. Apples. This one was done with a different approach. Rather than adding a gene, they knocked out the gene for the enzyme that causes browning when you cut an apple. So now you can cut these and they stay nice and fresh. They don't turn brown. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but it will be really interesting to see the consumer acceptance of it. Nothing was added. There's no foreign genes in there. Okay? There's no nutritional differences. Okay? Pretty much none of these, except for the vitamin A, there's no nutritional differences in the GM crop versus the unaltered crop. It's the same, and there's been a lot of studies to show that. Yes?
Is this also incorporated into fertilizers in order for the plant to just thrive and grow? Or is this just genetically inserted before it's applied into the earth?
Okay, so the modification is done inside the cells of the plant. fertilizer would be applied externally to the soil. So this is entirely done within the plant. And it's inherited through the seed. Yes?
Would gene addition eventually get rid of pesticides, like the use of pesticides?
Could the gene addition get rid of pesticides or reduce the use? Yes, and it has, substantially. As I say, we've got 20 years of track record now to look at it. Okay, so these are the ones currently in production. There's a lot of other traits that are being worked on, trying to get plants that are drought resistant, trying to get plants with a better panel of oils, okay, to better meet human health needs, okay, more unsaturated rather than saturated, to change the length of the fatty acid chain. So smaller biochemical differences that could make a real difference in terms of human health. Other traits, grow faster, things like that. So, but really trying to focus on traits that plant breeders don't have a way to manipulate. Okay, with golden rice, some plants make a lot of beta carotene. There don't happen to be any rice varieties that do. So they took the gene from another plant and put it in. Plant breeders can't make a cross that far between that distant of crops, but we can do it with these biotech procedures. Okay, so anything that plant breeders can do with traditional breeding, generally you don't waste the time and expense of doing it this way. Okay, there's a question there.
I'm just curious to know, can any modified food still be classified as organic?
The current definition of organic food, to my knowledge, specifies non-GMO.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Asking about the basically productivity of this method, obviously you have to do some kind of gene alteration that costs money. What does that mean to an average farmer? How much cost is it going to be to make all these modifications and maybe even grow this field out as much to include more stuff into the rice or cheaper kind of food products? How are the prices going to be affected?
How are the prices affected by that? Well, the farmer's price for the seed, it does go up. In general, farmers, out of all their expenses, seed is about 3%. It's not a big chunk. Is it too much? When you look at how fast farmers have adopted it, even in places where they can't sell it locally, like Spain and Germany, and yet they're still growing it, it says that it is a benefit economically. Farmers aren't going to grow it unless it benefits their bottom line. And so the added cost of the seed is trivial compared to what they get with reduced cost, either spraying herbicide, or not reduced, but reduced cost of spraying pesticide, okay, or higher yields because they don't lose yield to weeds that have invaded the field. Yes?
Would, so, way before, like, so past 20 years, wouldn't you consider genetically modified, say fruits, so people would probably crossbreed like a very big strawberry that's also linked with a juicy one, so wouldn't that be considered genetically modified as well?
Well, good question. Regular plant breeding, is that genetic modification? It depends upon your definition. It's still artificial selection, making crosses, selecting those progeny with the traits that you want. Humans have done it for 10, 15,000 years since the dawn of agriculture. Now we're inserting the genes and being more selective about what we add.
Yes.
Have there been any vaccine instances on the population size level of people having adverse effects from the food that have been occurring
Have there been any adverse effects from people consuming it? Not so far. Not so far. Again, we've got 20 years and we've got a lot of acreage to show that have been eaten, and not so far. Yes?
Doctor, it seems like with genetic modification, it seems like in science it started off as a positive thing, right? So you're trying to have resistance to certain pesticides. I guess my question is, when did big business come in and basically kind of, so what science is doing, trying to do the positive thing for humanity, and kind of, I guess, what are the social implications that happen, right? We know since NAFTA, it's taken a lot of farmers out in Mexico. So I guess I'm just curious on did it
Right.
stop? Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question about when did big, not pharma in the sense of farming, when did big companies get involved and what are the social implications? Big companies have always been involved in agriculture. It's a misconception to think that they haven't. If you look up Cargill, one of the largest privately held companies in the US, you don't hear about it a lot because it is privately held. But they control so much of the grain markets and all of the commodities markets. So it just so happens that Monsanto has purchased a lot of the patents that involve the genetic modification. And they're the ones that have been developing the crops for distribution in local areas. As I say, I don't own Monsanto stock. I left Calgene when Monsanto bought it. So, but I don't think it's fair to just point the finger at them and say, Monsanto's the bad guy. Farmers are not required to grow it. They choose to. All right, let's get back to the question you had earlier. Is it safe? Which is what you came up with here as well. Okay. The nutritional value is the same or better.
Can I throw in the 2 cents on that comment about farmers? Actually, it's interesting getting their perspective. Some of them don't want to use it, but because it helps them save money, they will jump on board. It's the financial gains. You make a good point. They're hard to ignore, but so they might not want to, but they will. You get a lot of somebody trying to compete with the Smiths, and it's like that happens around the whole block.
I don't think it's even only competing with the Smiths. If I could get a bigger payback for the same amount of work and money put into a given acreage, I don't care what Smith is doing down the road, I'm going to do it. In fact, if anything, that's one of the problems that Monsanto has had with their Bt corn. When you put the insecticide in the plant itself, you're applying a selection pressure. And the rules of evolution tell us that the pest populations will evolve resistance, which is exactly what happened. Now, population biologists have also said, well, the way around this is that you keep a reservoir of non-Bt corn so that you're always diluting out the resistant population with bugs that are susceptible to it. Okay? And so you keep everything at a manageable level and you don't create superbug. Now, to do that, you run the numbers. You have to plant 15% to 20% non-Bt corn. Will the farmers do that? No. Because they get a higher yield from Bt corn. Why should I plant 20% of my field to a lower yielding variety when my neighbor's not doing it? I want to get maximum here.
The farmers I talk to, they're like, you're not making money. They do it because they're into the lifestyle. And they drive big machines, and it's not something that I'd be interested in. But, I don't know. So they're working on loan money anyways. They're just trying to keep themselves favorable for funding. Was the impression I got from the farmer I talked to. So he's not, he got a house, he's got lots of land that he works, but he rents these fields, he rents his grain storage. He doesn't own any of these things. These are all like loaned, subsidized situations. And he just wants to keep that lifestyle going, so he felt like he was against the wall. And he's like, well, I've got to do these things so I can keep this going.
Farming is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
Even current U.S. large-scale agriculture, cash flow is horrendous. You have outputs all year long, and then you finally get inputs at the end of the season. It's not for the faint of heart at all. Okay, at any rate, okay, so back to are they safe to eat? Lots of studies done analyzing nutritional value. I say better in the case of vitamin A in the golden rice. It absolutely is better. They've come up with other genes that improve the iron content, that improve the zinc content. Those three are the biggest deficiencies in the human diet worldwide. Okay, so if they can stack those up, and there was a claim recently that that was done, although they don't get as high levels of vitamin A as in the current golden rice, but you can get better nutritional value, and certainly the same. Allergenic genes are not used. Okay? Scientists aren't dumb. They know the proteins that have been identified as allergens. They don't use those. They're very careful not to use genes from organisms where there might be that kind of a problem. And they're thoroughly tested long before they get to market. Yes?
Does this mean there's a possibility I can get cashews that won't trigger my allergies?
Well, that is a possibility in theory at this point. And I'm sure somebody's working on it, right? Because if it is specific proteins in nuts, you could use CRISPR-Cas9, knock out the gene for that protein. Yes, but go online, you'll find the DIY kit. Yeah. So again, that can be tested, avoided 20 years, hasn't come up to be a problem. Okay. The gene products themselves, okay, the glyphosate resistance, that gene is not toxic to humans. Even the Bt, which is a pesticide, is not toxic to humans. That pesticide is actually sprayed on organic farms. Okay? They have to, it's not stable, they have to spray weekly, so even if you have organic, it's considered to be a natural pesticide. Okay? It's made by bacterium, and so it's allowed as a spray. So the product had already been thoroughly tested and noted as safe to humans. Okay? And this gets back to the cashew thing. Using the new CRISPR technology, you can delete a gene. You're not even adding anything. You're only deleting it. Yes?
So my question is, what is the kind of a regulatory agency on this? Because as mentioned earlier, anybody can buy a kit of Cas9. If a farmer is going to benefit more, why not just buy and put a whole bunch of genes, and who's going to regulate all this? Yes, scientists, we hope they are responsible in the lab, they'll pay attention to not, do harm to humans.
So far, the companies have gone overboard in trying to reassure the public that these products are safe. And so USDA, U.S. Department of Ag, has tested the plants, the crops, whatever. They even asked the Food and Drug Administration to weigh in on it and to look at the trials, feeding trials, things like that. So in the U.S. at least, I know that's the two main regulatory agencies.
Who funds for the testing? Is that the company?
The company must fund the field trials.
And do they select the individuals that are involved in this research? Like say they select a random selection of individuals ranging in age, health.
Oh, in terms of humans?
Yeah.
I don't know. Most of the feeding trials, the initial ones are done on animal model systems. And in fact, most of the GM corn is used as cattle and corn and pig feed, cattle and chicken and pig feed.
They don't use humans at all?
It is, no, it is. Yeah, but I don't know. Okay, how's our time? Oh gosh, moving right along. Okay, here we go. What's the impact on the environment? I thought this was the second most important question to deal with. And here's the kicker. I think you have to look at it gene by gene. I don't think you can just say all GM crops. Okay, so for example, with BT crops, those that have the pesticide built in, fewer pesticides sprayed, millions of pounds of pesticide that are no longer sprayed. Okay? It also means that there's a lot fewer tractor trips through the field, the soil structure is conserved, there's less CO2 produced. I mean, BT, you'd have to spray it weekly throughout the entire growing season to have it be effective. All that's gone. Okay? So by not spraying it, again, non-pest insects don't get affected by it. It's only those insects that chew on the plant, on the crop, that are going to be affected. So that's kind of a good one. There were studies that came out about monarch butterflies that when they ate corn pollen of BT corn, that they seemed to suffer from that. When the work was repeated, in a way, the first experiments that were published, a little bit questionable on methodology. When it was done in a more thorough way, those results could not be confirmed. Okay? I'll leave it at that. And here's the other thing I alluded to earlier, that you're going to be selecting for BT-resistant pests. Okay? All you need to do, you have a certain amount of crop rotation, just variety rotation, non-BT crop. Okay? And then now what they're doing is just stacking different resistance genes. And that's also a way to deter the evolution of these pests. And it seems to be working pretty effectively.
Explain what stacking is.
Stacking, so they have more than one version of the BT gene, and they'll put that second version in the same cell along with the first version. So now you've got two different genes conferring resistance. It's really unlikely that you will get an insect that's resistant to both types. Yes?
So if you were to increase and just go to 5, would it be like fully impossible? Is that kind of the idea?
Much less likely, but never say never. Okay. Impact of GM crops on the environment. What else do we have? So looking at a different gene then, Roundup Ready crops, that's their trademark name. These are the ones resistant to glyphosate. Okay, you've got more glyphosate sprayed now. There's no question about that. More glyphosate is probably less safe for the farmer and possibly for the watershed. In terms of herbicides, glyphosate is probably one of the better ones. It doesn't persist. It degrades in the environment in about 3 days or so. Is it an herbicide? Yes, it's an herbicide. But it's not as bad as some of them. And what has alarmed me was a couple years ago, Dow Chemical got approval for an atrazine resistance gene and putting it into crops. Now, atrazine is a whole different type of herbicide. It persists. It stays in the watershed. It gets into the groundwater. It has nasty effects. Related to that is Agent Orange. That was basically a form of atrazine. Okay, so I'm not as keen on the use of that particular gene and encouraging the use of atrazine as on fields. But Roundup is not as bad. Okay. Another concern is that genes will transfer into wild plants nearby and that you're going to end up creating super weeds. Hasn't happened yet. They're looking for it. Doesn't seem to be a problem. Okay. Higher yields, here's one of the other impacts, and I think it's one that we need to think about. We often don't. Reduces the pressure to turn wild landscapes into farmland. You're getting a higher yield off the same amount of land. Humans are now pushing the limits of arable land, farmable land on the planet. Okay? By getting a 15, even 20% boost in yield, it means that much less land that needs to be farmed to produce the same amount of food. And I think globally we need to consider that. Okay, home stretch. What's the economic impact? Real briefly here. Well, Monsanto, those stockholders are very happy. Farmers, as I say, they grow them because they get a higher yield. Okay? Same amount of input. They're getting more money for their same amount of input. So yes, they enjoy growing them. They're happy to do it. You've got to pay more for that genetically modified seed. Okay, in developed countries, it's not a big problem. In developing countries, okay, it can be perceived as a bigger obstacle. That probably needs to be worked on. I must say, though, that it's only the Monsanto seeds there. Golden rice was developed by a public research institute in Switzerland, and although Monsanto distributes it, they get no profit from it. It's really in the public domain. Okay. Here's potential, and I highlight the potential. It's not yet achieved. Lots of work being done on it, but if we could get crops that would produce more reliably under stressed environments, drought's one of the big ones, okay, so that the reliability of the yield would improve. Okay? And there is certainly a lot of research being done on trying to create drought-resistant crops. It's a tough one to do. But certainly with climate change, with just annual weather cycles, okay, we run across droughts. Okay, California, we know that. So if you can have a more reliable food supply, that farmer who goes from borrowing money for 8 months of the year and then finally getting paid back so that they can repay their loans the last 2 months, it would be nice to know that you're going to make it to those last 2 months and get payback. Okay, so GM crops, actually not too many of these are currently being genetically modified, but there's always somebody who wants to tweak something, improve some attribute of a crop. So I don't know, I'm curious about feedback. Comments, opinions, questions? Yeah.
You know, the non-allergenic food.
Yes.
I mean, us as, or for myself as a consumer, I'm kind of stuck in between fertilizer and organic food, so it's not really like we have a choice, but I'm glad that we're able to actually get a more in-depth look at it sometimes. Stuck in between a rock and a hard place, you know?
Okay. I would urge you to continue learning more about it and how they are created, I think, and what they're good for or not. My personal position, you've got to look at the individual gene and what's going on there. Yes?
Gene, you mentioned that you didn't care for it, that had a long-lasting effect, starts with an A.
Oh, the herbicide is atrazine.
Okay, herbicide atrazine. Is there a particular orientation on type of plant? Like is it cereal, fruit? Is it specific to?
I haven't heard what Dow Chemical has done with the gene and what crops they're trying to put it into. I would imagine those for which herbicide resistance is a bonus, and that would be corn and soybean. Yes?
Just a comment, more than anything else, there's so many parallels between the pharma industry and genetically modified crops that it seems like there are although one has evolved a lot quicker than the other and has a lot more controls, and you talk about ethics and who controls it and where that is. But this industry seems so heavily profit motivated and controlled by a few that seems to be a big concern. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think that the GM crops that are currently commercialized, they were the first ones because there was a large profit motive. Clearly, there was a big need that was a valuable need. Okay? I think in the second wave, you're going to see different types of genes, different traits that are manipulated, where there's maybe not such a big profit motive, or at least the rewards are not as great. Yes?
When does it, like, where does it end, or does it seem like, kind of going off what pretty much you, does it seem like there's a lot of regulation with GMs? Like, we have apples, beautiful, stuff on the ground, and next we have bananas that's yellow all the time, and avocados, right? Then, like, I just imagine that this would just extend to unnecessary changes. And where does the legal system come in and say, hey, that's actually enough, this is actually occurring, not necessary change?
Okay, I need to correct a few things.
Okay.
Stay green bananas or stay yellow bananas, those are not GM produced.
No, but what if you're having an apple in the works of having a gene change that no longer grounds, what's next? Like, why is that necessary?
There could be a lot of things. What's next? Actually, bananas that have a vaccine in them, that make a vaccine. That's been talked about for a while. They've been able to put the vaccine into potatoes, but you still cook potatoes. And cooked vaccine is not as effective.
It just seems like it's more appearance-based in that regard versus a necessity to farmers getting food out there to be like nutritional.
There are plenty of traits that would be valuable for human health that maybe companies aren't working on, but that work is being done in public universities or international research places.
No, I guess my question is, I have a lot of, there's no one to really.
To regulate. Each country has its own regulation.
So why is it necessary to have an apple that no longer browns?
It's not. You don't need to buy it. Consumer choice.
Why make it then? Then we have an artificial word.
Okay, we can.
Is it required for these crops, foods that use these crops to be labeled?
It is currently not required in this state for GM foods to be labeled as such. Part of that is the distribution channels get mixed. We'd have to separate it out, starting with the tractor and the silo and everything all the way through. Yes?
Wouldn't it be possible, I mean, just like, how would you solve this problem with basically guaranteeing consumers, for example, that I'm gonna put Roundup resistance or some sort of pesticide resistance in this crop, but I'm gonna somehow guarantee that if it does cross-pollinate with another crop, that resistance will transfer.
Scientists have come up with ways to prevent the outcrossing and the transfer of it.
And is that in the gene, or is it?
It's part of the DNA that's inserted. Whether or not all of the commercial crops have that system, I don't know.
Shifting gears a little bit, I think for me, I would agree with you on the scientific side that they've been part of our agricultural system for a while now. It's pretty clear that there's a lot of benefit to them scientifically, and not really any discernible downside, at least that I've seen. But where I have concerns with the business practices surrounding them, and do worry that with these sorts of products being owned by such a small group of companies and the ability to patent genes, do you see any threats from monopolies or having this much control of the agricultural market in such a small concentrated area?
Monsanto hires more lawyers, same thing, lawyers than you can imagine. They don't own everything. They don't own everything.
But I didn't say Monsanto, but it is, you would agree, I think, that it's pretty concentrated. And you couldn't, nobody owns, say, a banana. But you can own
a BT banana.
You can own a BT banana.
Right. You don't have to buy a BT banana. I think that there are other genes being developed, smaller markets, different kinds of things that will be useful, and it's not going to be all Monsanto versus the rest of us kind of thing. Whatever. Okay.
So you said that this state isn't required to say whether or not it's non-GMO or if it's genetic.
Currently, food in California does not have to be labeled.
And then you say it's consumer's choice to buy it if it's non-GMO or not, right? So,
But unless you know,
that
yeah,
choice away from us
that's true.
by not being required.
It's true. Okay. I know, you got to cut me off. See, I had words of wisdom for students, so you're off the hook here. Thank you very much.